What was supposed to be a sacred, joyful consecration service, a moment of unity, worship, and elevation, suddenly turned into something no one in the room could have predicted. The air that once carried music and prayer was sliced open by words so sharp, so unexpected, that the entire congregation froze in disbelief. At the center of it all stood Bishop Todd Hall, a man known not just for his powerful preaching, but for his fearless conviction. He didn't whisper. He didn't wait until the service was over. In front of fellow bishops, pastors, and hundreds of worshipers, he stopped everything and delivered a rebuke that has since been called one of the most shocking moments in modern church history. Some said he went too far. Others said he was the only one courageous enough to say what everyone else was thinking. But one thing's for sure. The moment Bishop Todd Hall opened his mouth, the entire atmosphere shifted, because this wasn't a private disagreement. This was a public correction, right in the middle of what was supposed to be one of the holiest ceremonies in the church. So what really happened that day? Why did Bishop Hall feel the need to speak out so openly in front of everyone? And what was going on behind the scenes that made silence no longer an option? Stay tuned, because what we uncovered about that consecration service will leave you speechless. This is the story of the rebuke that shook the sanctuary, and the message that continues to echo through every pulpit, pew, and platform even now. To truly understand why Bishop Todd Hall's rebuke hit so hard, you first have to understand what a consecration service actually represents. In the Christian church world, especially within Pentecostal, holiness, and charismatic traditions, a consecration isn't just another Sunday service. It's sacred. It's solemn. It's a moment when heaven and earth are believed to meet. It's the day when a minister is officially affirmed as a bishop, recognized not just by man, but symbolically by God Himself. It's not about status or applause. It's about submission and responsibility. Every gesture, every prayer, every drop of oil carries deep meaning. The oil represents divine anointing. The laying on of hands represents spiritual succession, a passing of authority that dates back to biblical times. The garments symbolize humility and service, not luxury or power. It's a ceremony built on reverence, not routine. Families dress in their finest clothes, choirs sing songs that make the walls shake, and fellow leaders gather to bear witness to what should be a life-changing moment. The candidate being consecrated kneels before God and the congregation, accepting the weight of leadership, vowing to serve with integrity, compassion, and holiness. That's what makes consecration services so emotional. They're not just about one person's promotion. They're about the community's agreement to uphold spiritual accountability. It's supposed to be a day of joy and humility, where egos are left outside the sanctuary door. But in this particular service, something didn't feel right. Beneath the polished robes and powerful songs, there were whispers, quiet unease that only a few could sense. While the congregation saw smiles and ceremony, some leaders noticed signs that not everything was as pure as it appeared. And when those unseen tensions start to build inside what's meant to be a sacred space, it's only a matter of time before something breaks. Because in the house of God, even the smallest crack in unity can echo louder than the choir. And soon, that crack would become a moment of reckoning, one that would stop the entire service cold. From the outside, it looked like everything was perfect. The sanctuary was packed wall to wall. The choir's harmonies lifted through the air like incense, and the atmosphere was thick with excitement. People had traveled from all over to witness this moment. A new bishop being elevated, a milestone that would be remembered for years to come. Every detail seemed flawless. The procession was orderly. The ministers were dressed in immaculate vestments, and the audience was caught up in worship. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and smiles filled the room. To the average person in the pew, it was just another beautiful, spirit-filled consecration. But for those who were closer to the platform, the bishops, elders, and seasoned ministers, there was something different about this one. A subtle tension hung in the air, the kind you can't see but can definitely feel. Some said it was the way the service seemed more about performance than presence. Others noticed moments where, Reverence gave way to showmanship, laughter, and gestures that felt a bit too casual for such a holy ceremony. And then there were the looks. Small glances exchanged between certain leaders on the platform. You could see them trying to keep composure, but their eyes told another story. Something was off, and those who were spiritually sensitive felt it immediately. Still, the program continued as planned. Prayers were read, scripture was recited, and music filled the space. Everything appeared orderly on the surface, but spiritually, there was unrest. A quiet storm building under the rhythm of praise and worship, because while everyone else was celebrating elevation, Bishop Todd Hall was sitting there discerning something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. Those who know Bishop Hall know he's not easily shaken, nor is he the type to interrupt lightly. But on that day, as the ceremony moved forward, he couldn't stay silent any longer. It was as if a line had been crossed, a spiritual boundary that demanded correction. The joy of the moment was being overshadowed by what he perceived as disorder, pride, and misplaced focus. And so, as the candidate stood in honor, surrounded by applause, Bishop Todd Hall did the unthinkable. He rose from his seat. The room went silent. Heads turned, and within seconds, what had been a service of celebration turned into a scene no one would ever forget. Because when he spoke, his words didn't just interrupt the program, they split the atmosphere. When Bishop Todd Hall stood up, it was as if time froze. The choir went silent, the organ faded into stillness, and all eyes turned toward him. He didn't need a microphone. His presence alone commanded the room. His expression wasn't angry, but it was firm, unshakably serious. The kind of look that says, this is not a moment for applause. This is a moment for correction. In a voice that carried both authority and grief, he spoke words that pierced through the air like a sword. Words calling the church back to order, reverence, and holiness. He reminded everyone that consecration isn't about performance or prestige. It's about humility, purity, and accountability before God. The exact phrasing of Bishop Hall's rebuke has been recounted in many ways, depending on who you ask, but the heart of his message was unmistakable. He addressed what he perceived as disorder, ego, and a spirit of self-promotion creeping into what should have been a sacred moment. He didn't call names or attack anyone directly. Instead, he called the atmosphere itself into question. Witnesses say his voice carried the weight of conviction, echoing off the walls of the sanctuary. This is not entertainment. This is holy. This is consecration. And if we lose reverence in God's house, we lose everything. The congregation froze. Moments earlier, the room was full of applause and energy. Now you could hear a pin drop. Some bowed their heads. Others looked around in disbelief. A few even began to weep quietly. For the candidate being consecrated, the shock was visible. Eyes lowered, hands trembling slightly. Other bishops tried to remain composed, but their expressions betrayed the tension. No one dared to interrupt. Everyone knew something extraordinary was happening, not out of disrespect, but out of conviction. And when Bishop Hall finished speaking, he didn't offer an apology. He didn't soften his tone. He simply sat down, leaving a silence so heavy that no one quite knew what to do next. Was it divine correction or an unnecessary disruption? That question split the room in two. For some, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that holiness must never take a back seat to ceremony. For others, it felt like a public embarrassment, a moment that overshadowed what should have been a day of joy. But regardless of how anyone felt, one thing was undeniable. The service would never be remembered for the consecration itself, but for the rebuke that stopped it cold. Because in that moment, Bishop Todd Hall didn't just interrupt a program, he ignited a movement. And as the dust began to settle, whispers began to spread. What had led to this? Why had he felt so strongly that he couldn't wait until later? The answers to those questions lie not in that single moment, but in what had been happening long before the service even began. To the average worshiper sitting in that sanctuary, Bishop Todd Hall's rebuke seemed to come out of nowhere, a sudden thunderclap in the middle of what had been a smooth and spiritual ceremony. But for those familiar with the inner workings of church leadership, this wasn't spontaneous at all. This was the eruption of tension that had been simmering quietly for weeks, maybe even months. Behind the smiling faces and polished protocols, there were already whispers. Rumors of disorganization, concerns about conduct, and questions. Questions that some leaders didn't want to say out loud. You see, in the church world, the process of consecrating a bishop is supposed to be handled with extreme care. It's not a promotion, it's a calling. It's not about ambition, it's about assignment. But according to several sources close to the situation, that sense of sacred preparation had begun to erode in recent years. Some leaders accused others of turning consecration into a status symbol, using the office of bishop as a badge of influence rather than a burden of responsibility. And this particular consecration? It had all the signs of controversy. Reports suggest that questions had been raised about whether the candidate was truly ready for such a sacred office. Some felt the process was rushed, that the candidate hadn't undergone enough spiritual vetting or mentorship. Others whispered about inconsistencies in behavior, moments that didn't align with the humility expected of someone stepping into that kind of role. Bishop Todd Hall had heard the concerns. In fact, sources say he'd even tried to address them privately before the ceremony. But as often happens in leadership circles, not everyone wanted to make waves. Some believed it was better to keep quiet for the sake of unity and avoid public embarrassment. But to Bishop Hall, unity without truth isn't unity at all. He spent his entire ministry preaching about holiness, order, and spiritual integrity. And those who know him will tell you, he's not one to sit in silence when he senses disorder. To him, letting the consecration proceed without acknowledging the underlying issues would have been the same as endorsing them. So when he rose that day and spoke, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of conviction. A conviction that the ceremony had lost sight of its true purpose. This wasn't just about one candidate. It was about a growing culture in the modern church, a culture that, in his eyes, was drifting away from accountability and toward performance. And while some leaders tried to hold it together on the outside, Bishop Hall's rebuke forced everyone to face the uncomfortable truth. The church couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Because if consecration becomes a show, the spirit behind it loses power. And for Bishop Hall, that was unacceptable. What happened that day wasn't just a reaction. It was a statement, a stand, a public declaration that holiness still matters, even when it's inconvenient. But what came after that moment would test the entire community. The backlash, the support, the debates that would divide pastors, ministers, and members across the nation. Because once a moment like that goes viral, it doesn't stay in the sanctuary. It hits the headlines. It hits social media, and it forces everyone watching to pick a side. The moment Bishop Todd Hall's rebuke echoed through the sanctuary, the ripple effect was instant and unstoppable. What began as a sacred ceremony quickly transformed into one of the most talked about moments in church circles nationwide. Within hours, clips of the confrontation began circulating online. Some viewers were stunned into silence, while others flooded social media praising Bishop Hall for saying what so many had been afraid to say. But not everyone agreed. Critics argued that such a powerful correction should have been handled privately, warning that public confrontation risked humiliating the candidate and dividing the congregation. Yet supporters countered that truth doesn't always wait for comfort. Sometimes it needs to be spoken right in the middle of the moment. In the days that followed, phone lines buzzed, church blogs exploded, and leadership meetings grew tense. Some pastors quietly admitted they respected Bishop Hall's courage, even if they wouldn't have done the same. Others distanced themselves altogether, fearful of controversy. The candidate himself, according to those close to him, went through a period of deep reflection, shaken, humbled, but ultimately changed. And beyond the personal fallout, something remarkable happened. Across churches and denominations, conversations began. Real, raw, overdue conversations about what leadership truly means. Senior pastors started re-examining consecration processes, asking harder questions about character, humility, and readiness. Congregations began holding leaders to higher standards, no longer impressed by titles alone. Weeks later, even those who had criticized Bishop Hall couldn't deny one thing: the church was talking again. His rebuke had reignited a spirit of accountability that had quietly faded over time. It reminded everyone that leadership isn't a performance. It's a calling, one that demands integrity over image. For Bishop Hall himself, the moment became both a burden and a badge. Some saw him as controversial, others as courageous. But history tends to favor those who speak truth when it's risky. In the end, that single act, standing up in the middle of a consecration, became more than just a viral moment. It became a turning point, a reminder that holiness still matters, that accountability is never optional, and that sometimes the loudest act of faith is refusing to stay silent. Because when reverence is restored, revival follows, and that's exactly what Bishop Todd Hall wanted all along. In the weeks and months that followed, Bishop Todd Hall's bold stand became more than just a viral headline. It became a mirror reflecting the deeper issues in modern ministry. Churches across the country began rethinking how leadership should look. Consecrations became more intentional, with stricter spiritual vetting and renewed focus on humility and accountability. What once felt like routine ceremony was now treated with the reverence it deserved. For many pastors, Bishop Hall's rebuke reignited conversations long overdue about pride in the pulpit, integrity in leadership, and the dangers of turning sacred roles into stages for self-promotion. What some called disruption, others called divine correction. His message was clear: you can't elevate people publicly and ignore problems privately. Despite criticism, Bishop Hall's courage elevated his influence even more. To his supporters, he became a symbol of fearless conviction, a man willing to risk reputation for righteousness. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny that his actions forced the church to pause, reflect, and realign. His name became synonymous with spiritual accountability, a leader unafraid to say what others whispered behind closed doors. And in the end, this moment did more than challenge a single consecration. It changed how many saw leadership itself. It reminded everyone that titles don't make a bishop, character does. That holiness must never be sacrificed for harmony. Bishop Todd Hall's rebuke wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoration. It called the church back to the basics: truth, order, and reverence. Because sometimes, correction is the highest form of love, and years from now, when people speak of that consecration, they won't just remember the garments or the prayers. They'll remember the courage of one man who refused to let silence speak louder than truth.